Wow, it's the perfect watercolor.
Today, I will share with you what might be the perfect watercolor for coloring. Any guesses? Hi, I'm Regina, and this is the third video on the water medium series using water medium in coloring books. Today, I will share the third type of watercolor that I feel might be the perfect watercolor for coloring. Are you ready? It's the Gansai Tambi watercolor. So, what is Gansai Tambi? Gansai means vibrance and Tambi means aesthetic. They are traditional watercolors and designed to be used on washi paper, usually in single layer, but they can also be used in multiple layers. As you can see in my very fancy illustrations here, very high tech, the Gansai Tambi paints are made with larger pigments than the traditional watercolor. And so this makes them both more opaque and easier to lift because of the larger pigments. Because the larger pigments sit more on the surface and don't penetrate as far into the paper. The binder used in Gansai Tambi watercolors is different than gum arabic that's usually used in Western watercolor. And because of that, it created this semi glossy to glossy finish to the paint, especially when it's been applied heavily. They are easy to wet, it takes very little water to get them going, but because paints on washi paper easily bleed, they were formulated to stay in place, so they work better as wet on dry than wet on wet. Now, don't get me wrong, the color flows easily from the brush to the paper, but once they're on the paper, they don't flow as much. But on the plus side, you are less likely to get blossoms or cauliflower effect or bleeding. But on the minus side, it's harder to get blended soft edges or colors that runs together mixing on the page, which I don't mind. Traditionally, they are not light fast. I heard some people said they are, but there's no light fast rating anywhere or any pigment information, so who knows? The most popular brand is the Kuretake brand, and I have the 48 color set because I gotta have the big set. I also have the new Art Nouveau set if you watch my recent haul video. And I also have this portable 14 color set from the haul video before that. Now, the Kuretake set generally runs about $1 per pen, depending on which set you get. The Art Nouveau's set runs a bit higher because it's a newer set. And the portable 14 color set I got for about $16, which is a very good deal. So, this is the pamphlet that came with the new Art Nouveau set I just got. And this is why I thought that this paint might be the perfect watercolor for coloring books. So in here it says Japanese traditional paint for professional artists and crafters. It can be used as a gouache and watered down for use as a watercolor, ideal for sketch, illustration, card making, and more. In full color, the Gansai are opaque, like gouache, but you can control that with the amount of water you use. So the more water you use, then it will behave more like watercolor, and the less water you use, it will behave more like gouache. And on the back here, one thing that they mentioned is Gansai pens may exhibit cracking due to extreme dryness, however, it does not affect their quality. Occasionally, Gansai pen texture may look rough due to tiny air bubbles which can occur during production, which does not affect their quality. So I'm gonna show you those things. So this is the new Art Nouveau set I just got, and there's cracking on this pen right here. and I don't see cracking anywhere else. But I do see air bubbles on this pen, a little bit there, in here, in here. So that's just part of the pouring process. I also have a budget option. You can get this Komorebi paints from Mozart Supplies from Amazon. This Mozart brand has 40 colors, including 6 neon colors and 8 metallic colors. And it runs about $24. And sometimes they have deals from time to time. So, in the previous two videos, I've covered the brushes and all the other supplies you're going to need to use water medium in your coloring books. If you haven't watched those, I'll link them up here. I'll use the same mixed media brushes as I've been using and a palette because these paints don't come with a space to mix your color. I'm going to use this ceramic palette. All right, let's head over to the table and let's compare these paints with watercolors and gouache. So now we're going to test and compare between traditional watercolor, Gansai Tambi, and gouache to see the property of each. So I have got a few pieces of watercolor paper here. This smaller one is 5x7 Strathmore ready cut paper. It's 100% cotton. And the 6x9 is uh, the B paper, watercolor paper, also 100% cotton. The reason I'm using 100% cotton is so that we can see the flow of the paint once we put them here and see the property of the paint. So I'm going to be using the Male Yang watercolor, the one that I used for the in the watercolor video. So I'm going to test the ultramarine for all three paints. I'm going to use the ultramarine in the watercolor, ultramarine in Gansai Tambi, and um, ultramarine in gouache. So we are comparing the same pigments in all three different types of paint. Okay, I'm going to start with the watercolor first. So let me grab some paint, put it on my palette here. Just let's add a little water so we can see if we just putting it wet on dry, right? So that's watercolor wet on dry. And let's see the Gansai. So this is the Gansai Tambi, wet on dry. Very vibrant, very vibrant color. All right, so now I'm gonna put a little bit of the ultramarine gouache in here. So I'm just, my brush is just pretty much just damp. I just put it in there. So our gouache is not gonna be super um, wet or very liquid. I guess this is the consistency of, I don't know, this might be a little more like cream. Maybe add a little more water to this. right, so this is the gouache. All right, so now, so this is the difference between each of them. Let me label this so you know. Okay, so now we're gonna do wet on wet. So let's, the brush is still a little bit of blue on it. See how wet it is. And let's put our watercolor in there. You can see the color travels. When I tilt the paper, it travels wherever the wet area is at, because that's just the property of watercolor. All right, so now we're going to do the same with the Gansai Tambi. I'm gonna tilt my paper. I don't know if you can tell, but it doesn't move as fast as the watercolor. It's slower. It moves, but it is slower. All right, so now we're going to do the same with the gouache. Can you see that the gouache barely moves at all? It's not moving to where the water is at. So we're gonna let these dry, and then we're gonna test. We're gonna lift the colors to see how easy it is to lift each paint. All right, see you in a second. All right, so I think our, at least the wet on dry tests that we did, they're dry, but let me just check. Remember to use the back of your hand to test. It's not damp anymore. It's not cool to the touch. Yes, the gouache is definitely dry. So all the watercolor, Gansai Tambi, and gouache, they're all dry. So we're gonna test to see how easy they're to lift. So I dipped my brush into the water and dry them, and you're gonna gently brush and blot. All right. I'm gonna do the same, the Gansai Tambi sample we did. I'm gonna blot your paper towel. All right, I don't know if you can tell, but with the watercolor, it lifts a little bit of the color. This is just one pass of the um, lifting of the color. With Gansai Tambi, there's a little bit more lifting, and with gouache, you can tell it lifted a lot more compared to the other two. So as we suspected, and based just on our what we know about the pigments, because the pigments are larger, so the watercolor is more finely grounded, and then Gansai Tambi is a little bigger pigments, and gouache even bigger pigments. And we know the bigger pigments, the easier it is for the uh, pigments to be lifted because they don't sink into the paper. So you can tell with the gouache, you get a little bit more color lifted, less with Gansai Tambi, and even less with the watercolor. Okay, so now we're going to test these three paints on a coloring book. So I picked this Cottage Core Galore book because it doesn't have as thick of paper compared to other coloring books. So if you can hear that, it's pretty thin. It's not as thin as Amazon printed books, but it's definitely not as thick as, like Johanna Basford's books or, Hannah Carlson's and uh, other books like that with thicker paper. So I thought we will test these three paints on this page right here. So I'm going to use this Imperial Violet um, color from the Gansai Tambi, and I'm going to use this Dioxazine Violet from the Mailiang set, and I'm going to mix a little bit of primary red, into my ultramarine gouache right here. So I'm just mixing the watercolor, the dioxazine purple to tea consistency. Right, I think that's a good mix right there. Now I'm mixing the imperial violet. Okay, I think that's a good tea consistency. And now with the gouache, I mix a little bit of the ultramarine with the primary red. It should be, yes, that should be fairly thick. So I'm going to thin it a little bit on this corner. Okay, I think that's a pretty good consistency. Okay, so I think I'm going to, just to make it easier, let's just do this as watercolor. That one is Gansai Tambi, and this one is for the gouache. Okay, so we've applied the watercolor, Gansai Tambi, and gouache. And let's check to see if they have any bleed through. Yeah, so there's a little bit of bleed through on the watercolor, little bit on a little bit of bleed through on the Gansai Tambi, and there's no bleed through with the gouache. So let's leave these to dry, and we'll come back and add a little bit more color with a darker value, and then we'll take a look at it and check. All right, I'll be right back. Okay, so it looks like these first layers are dry. So now I'm going to mix a darker value for each of the paint, and we'll see how much the paint will bleed through the paper. Okay, so I'm adding a little bit of dioxazine into the watercolor. Okay, so I think that's a good value there. So I'm going to add it to the watercolor. Right, so while still a little bit wet, I'm going to try to soften the line a little bit. So that's the watercolor. Now I'm going to add a little bit more of Imperial Violet to our Gansai Tambi mixture. This one is the lightest value that we applied. Might be a little too dark. Yeah, I think that's good. But do you see how thick the Gansai Tambi is? Just a little bit more paint and you can, like with not too much water, it really looks like gouache. So this is the Gansai Tambi. Right, I'm gonna try to blend the edges. now we're going to add the darker value for the gouache. We want to find the consistency of milk. It's still a little bit too thick. It might be like it was probably closer to cream. So let's see if we can get to milk consistency. Yeah, I think that's much better. Yeah, that's much better. All right, so this is something we can't really do with gouache. We can't really blend it. We're gonna have to wait until it's dry. Okay, so we're gonna wait until it's dry. But before that, let's check to see if there's any more ghosting in the back. No, it's pretty much the same. It's pretty much the same bleed through as previously. There's nothing for the gouache. All right, so let's wait until they're dry and I'll see you in a second. Okay, so I think they're all dry, but I just noticed something. In the Gansai Tambi set, there's a white pan here. And from gouache, we learned we lighten the value with white. So now if we use this white pan as the paint to lighten the value for the Gansai Tambi instead of using water, I wonder how that will affect if we're going to get any ghosting in the back. So I'm gonna mix a little bit of white and the purple, and we're gonna test it on this um, flower here to see how they look like if we change the consistency of the paint instead of lighten it with water like this one. Okay, I'm gonna mix the paint and I'll be right back. Okay, so I've mixed this white with the imperial violet. Let's test to see. That's pretty light, I think. Let's see if I can add just a little bit more white. But the consistency is, I would say, like milk. Yeah, that's a lighter color. And I'm gonna try using that on this pansy right here as the base layer. So that's the base layer using combination of white and the violet. And let's check to see if there's any ghosting. And we do not have any ghosting whatsoever. Look at that. That's perfect. That's definitely one way to use Gansai Tambi. You can lighten the value without using the water so that you get slightly thicker paint, and but you still have the light value. And using it this way, I didn't feel like um, the texture didn't feel like gouache to me, even though we are mixing, um, technically this is how we lighten the value with gouache by using the white paint. But it feels light to me. It didn't feel as thick as the gouache. So I love this. I love it. Even in person, it even though we mix the white, it still looks like it's the same color as this light value in this first layer and on this flower. It looks the same in here in real life, even though we use the white, and we don't get any ghosting with using the white. So this is another technique you can use by mixing the color with the white to line the value, um, but without having that a chalky feeling that you get with gouache. Okay, so I'm gonna let this dry, and I'm going to add the darker value and see um, what happens. All right, see you in a bit. All right, so it looks like our first layer is dry. Let me check. Yeah, it's not damp anymore. So I've mixed a little bit more paint into the darker value here. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's a good dark value. So let's add that to our flower here. I'm gonna let that dry, and based on this previous fancy that we did, the one with the Gansai Tambi, it looks like when I try to softening the edges, it's not really softened that much. It doesn't. So, like I said earlier in the beginning of the video, the Gansai Tambi um, is better to be put on wet on dry, and not wet on wet. And also, we because the paint doesn't flow as much as watercolor, um, we're gonna get those hard edges. I don't mind the hard edges, but if you um, don't like hard edges, this might not be the paint for you. But we can try to see if using, because we use the white paint to create this light value on this flower right here. I'm gonna let this dry and see if we can mix it a little bit to soften the edges of the dark value. We'll wait until it's dry, and then I'll come back and try to soften the edges. Okay, it's now dry, And I'm gonna try to see if I can soften the edges a little bit. Just an experiment. Okay, I'm gonna wet my brush, wipe off on my paper towel here. The color does come off a little bit, like we saw earlier. Yeah, it does. Look at that. I don't know if you can see it, but I can. Okay, so we can actually soften the edges a little bit. And let's see how it looks. Look in the back. No ghosting, nothing. It doesn't even feel like it's buckling. So that's another plus right there. So, okay, so now that we've seen these paints in action, um, as we can see, the paint is not as flowy as flowy. Yes, that's a that's the official term. Flowy as the watercolor, and I think that's a good thing for a coloring book because it stays right within the line. I don't care if, if the paint is if I paint outside the line, but some people might. So if you love to be able to paint within the line, then Gansai Tambi is the paint for you. And it doesn't feel, now we know we can lighten the value with using the white paint because this light value and that light value looks the same to me in real life. Um, and I think it looks the same in on camera too. And it doesn't feel chalky like the gouache. Um, and I don't mind the way this uh, when I try to soften the edges on the first attempt here with just the using water to with the base layer compared to using the white paint as the base layer. Um, they look the same to me, and the color did actually blend a little bit. As you can tell with the gouache, it is a bit chalky, and we can't really blend the edges of the dark value because that's just the property of you know of the gouache. And because we're working on coloring books, it's easier to blend two colors with gouache when they're both um, wet, meaning like wet on wet. But with coloring books, they dry much faster. So you're going to get a lot more hard edges. I don't mind it, but I like it on certain illustrations and would like a little bit more blendability, I guess, with like flowers and stuff like that. So I really love how this turns out. What? How about you? Do you like the results that Gansai Tambi produces on you know regular coloring book. And this paper is not thick, and I did not put any kind of um, get gesso or anything like that on this paper. So this is just plain paper, and we did not get any ghosting whatsoever in the back. And I'm just gonna show you how the paint looks like on the palette. I don't know if you can see, the gouache is pretty much almost like 50% dried already. The Gansai Tambi is still wet. Um, and yeah, so that's also another plus. Something that I noticed with gouache, it's I have to keep re-wetting it, um, because I'm making a lot of paint. I know there's a way for you to be able to keep the paint wet, but I'm mixing a lot of paint, so I prefer to use a ceramic palette like this. But with the Gansai Tambi, it's still wet, and I'm gonna be able to keep using this without having to work on the paint itself continuously. Okay, I think we are done with our exploration here, and I'm really happy and excited about using Gansai Tambi more in coloring books, and I hope you do too. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you don't, thumbs down. Easy peasy. If you find value in this video and would like to see more of content like this, please subscribe. It's that button right there. It helps the channel and it's free. Also, don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you know when the next video is up. Also, please comment below one thing that you learned from this video and let me know if you have any questions. Have fun with your self-care.